Hello. How is everyone doing tonight? Good? Even with the rain? Okay. My name is Margie Cook, and I am part of the team that brings you live from NYPL. And I want to say hello to everyone who is watching right now, those of you in this room, and those of you watching online. I am so pleased to introduce the author and scholar, Devoney Looser, author of Sister Novelists, the trailblazing Porter sisters who paved the way for Austen and the Brontes, who is here tonight in conversation with acclaimed literary critic and biographer Ruth Franklin, and one of today's most talented performers, Beanie Feldstein, who will perform a reading from selected letters by the Porter sisters. And you can find their full bios on your printed programs or on the event listing online. So, the Porter sisters is an example of literary detective work and storytelling at its finest and most pure. Who are these brilliant self-made sisters? Well, between the two, they published 26 books and were known as authors of great renown. Then history left them behind. So what happened to them and why is the subject of Devoney's incredible book. To rescue the Porter sisters from literary obscurity, Devoney relied largely on their extensive correspondence, and many of those letters are housed right across the street in the library's Carl H. Forsheimer collection of Shelley and his circle. As the name implies, the Forsheimer collection has a special focus on the lives and works of the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley and his contemporaries, including his second wife, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, her parents, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and many of their friends and fellow writers. How the Porter sisters are connected to the Shelleys, perhaps Devoney can fill us in later. This amazing collection, right there across the street, contains rare manuscripts, books, artwork, and so much more. And should your research project need it, all of it is available for free, with nothing other than your library card. Devoney's book is available for purchase for those of you in this room and through our online shop for those of you who are attending virtually. Whichever way you purchase it, and please do if you are able, proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. And for those of you here tonight, there will be a signing after the event. And online folks, if you need a link to purchase, we'll put it in the chat now if we haven't already. And of course, if you have a library card, you can borrow the book for free. So before I turn it over, I have a few housekeeping items to note. I'd like to tell you about some of our upcoming events in the days and weeks ahead. This Friday, after a 3-year hiatus, Library After Hours is back. Join us for exclusive after-hour access and celebrate the end of Women's History Month with a special peek into the lives and works of some of the most iconic women in our collections. On April 13th, please join Dasha Kuiper in conversation with David Hyde Pierce. Her new book on Alzheimer's and caregiving offers an entirely new way to understand the symbiotic relationships between patients and those tending to them. And on April 20th, we are delighted to host a virtual conversation with Jeff Dyer and Chloe Cooper-Jones for a discussion ranging from sports matches to personal everyday battles, presented in partnership with the Royal Society of Literature. So be sure to register at nypl.org/live, and we hope to see you there. And you may have noticed an index card on your seat. So please use those cards for writing questions. You'll see a staff member come around and collect them during the program. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Minaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course, by all of you, our wonderful supporters near and far. Thank you for all that support, and thank you again for being here. And with that, thank you for bearing with me. I will turn it over, and let's please welcome tonight's guests.
All right, here we are under the bright lights.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you so much, Margie, for that introduction. It's so nice to be here in this lovely setting on this gloomy, rainy night to talk about literature. So cozy. So, I want to get started. I'm sure you get this question all the time, but I wanted to start with the origin story of this book. I know you've written that you first came upon Jane Porter's letters in the library. So as a biographer, I'm just so curious. How did that happen? Were you researching something else and you just happened to come upon Jane's letters. Take us back to that first moment when you met the Porter sisters.
Absolutely. I love this part of the story. So thank you for starting there, Ruth. So I was working on a book on women writers in old age in Great Britain, and I knew that Jane Porter had lived into her 70s. And I wanted to just find what was it like for her as an older woman facing the literary marketplace, trying to produce new writing in her later life. But I kept, when I was reading these archival letters about her later life, being drawn back to look at these letters that she published with a sister who, that she had written to a sister and that were not published, and they were gripping.
And so you already knew who she was at that point.
Well, by that point, I knew that she had a sister who was also a writer. And yes, I knew that she herself had published a number of novels, had achieved some success with them. I didn't have a sense of how famous she was. That came later when I started researching the early 19th century context. But reading the two sisters' letters, I just found myself caught up in this world and feeling like I was a fly on the wall, because so many of their letters include not only confessions of all of the things they're dealing with in the literary marketplace and the marriage marketplace, and their complicated lives and the ways that they were in debt and all of the famous people they were with and the infamous people they were with. At that point, I didn't really know that. But what I knew is that there were these two sisters speaking to each other in these heartfelt ways. And I just got drawn in. I felt called, ultimately, is how I put it in the beginning of the biography, to tell their story, because it hadn't previously been told. This is the first biography of these two once very famous sisters. And, I think it's really important to me that this story has seen the light of day.
Yeah, and I think, your passion for this story is really evident in the book, and your affection for the sisters and your commitment to tell their story and get it out there. So it seems it's so unusual, right, to have this kind of correspondence between two women, especially, they spent a lot of time together, but they also spent a fair amount of time apart. So you've got letters spanning decades and decades of their lives, right? What was it like to sort of watch that relationship as the fly on the wall?
Yeah, so I think I felt a little bit like a voyeur, right?
Yeah.
I felt like I was reading things that maybe I shouldn't have read sometimes. But I also felt like there was this story that was to the side of the things that I knew about this period. I think when we talk about Jane Austen's life, we are working from about 160 letters, not so many. And when we read accounts of her life, we often read about, well, this is what a polite woman did or didn't do. The Porters were polite women, but in these thousands of surviving letters and manuscripts, they are describing things that they were not supposed to be doing and that they got away with, and that they were able to remain on the side of the polite-impolite divide despite doing. And I also found that fascinating too.
Yeah, I was really struck by that in your book. I mean, it's something we don't see in Jane Austen or the other fiction of the time. We see this, really strenuous adherence to the mores of that moment. And it's really fascinating to watch the Porter sisters talk about, which boundaries can we push
Right.
and to what extent before our reputations will suffer too much. How did it happen that so many of these letters were preserved? Because, of course, as you know, that's such a big problem with writing women's history, is that women's letters tend not to be kept in the same way that, many letters of men of the same time period have been.
I think one reason they survived is because they were so famous in their lifetimes. So there was a sense that keeping their correspondence meant something, not only to them, but to other people. So many of their letters to and from others survived because they were sought by autograph hounds, right? So the fame definitely led to some of the retention of this information. But I think most of the credit really should go to the older sister, Jane. Jane Porter lived longer than Maria, and late in her life, she had this archive of information from her family. And she leaves very specific instructions. She says, I do not want these letters ever to be published. Oops. She says, but I also, if it were up to me, Mariah's letters would live forever. And she says, I cannot bring myself to destroy them. I can't bring myself to do it. And I think she knew, she loved her sister dearly. If there's a love story in the book that's most lasting, I think it's the two sisters' love for each other. But also the keeping of these papers is also, I think, an act of love on Jane's part. Then, as you know, the end of the book talks about how they came down to us, and that's almost a Gothic tale of manuscript hoarding and sales at auction and all sorts of things I could go into if we want to go down that road.
Well, just give us a little sense of how the letters came to be kind of scattered across the world in the way they are. A bunch of them are here, as we discussed. You've originally found them in the Huntington Library. You talk about a little in the introduction about how your research took you to archives all over the place in search of these letters.
Yeah, the largest numbers of these papers ended up in the United States. So they ended up in the NYPL, as we've heard, at the Huntington Library, as you mentioned, and at the University of Kansas Spencer Library. The three largest portions of them were bought at auction in the mid-20th century. How did they come on the market in the mid-20th century? That's the strange story.
Yeah.
Jane, when she died in 1850, she had never married, Mariah had never married, and there wasn't an obvious heir. And they came onto the auction market, and they were sold in this unsorted way that made headlines. It was like in the gossip papers. Be careful which ladies you write to who might save your papers and sell them at auction after they, be sold at auction after they die. And so they were ultimately picked up by this man named Sir Thomas Phillips, who was a notorious manuscript hoarder, said he wanted to own every manuscript that ever existed. And they sort of moldered away in his incredible collections for almost a century. His heirs spent a century getting rid of all of his amassed stuff.
Wow.
So during that time, the Porter sisters' once very high literary reputation started to fall. And I think by the time these letters came on the market, they really just weren't valued anymore.
They were just more of a curiosity.
They were
at that
cheap.
point.
They were cheap, and there were no export controls, and libraries in the United States bought them up.
Wow. I mean, it's such a gesture of confidence in a way on Jane's part that she created this archive for herself and her sister. And, a gesture of faith in the future that somebody like you is going to come along someday and tell their story with love and respect and care in the way that you do. How do you negotiate that, that tension between these are private letters that weren't intended to be published and the desire to get the story out there for posterity? Yeah. How do you kind of reconcile that in your own mind?
I think because these sisters are so long dead, I don't feel quite the same sense of invading their privacy. Mm-hmm. And I think because they were so famous and because their fame was actually very fraught, part of bringing out the story of how difficult it was for them to be what they would have called public women, that is, authors in the public eye, and create private happiness. That this is a story that really can't be told except through these very confessional letters. Mm-hmm. And I think that, to me, overrides the sense of their long ago wish that these not be published. And I should say that Jane Porter did hope somebody would write her memoir. She hoped that somebody would write her memoir, her sister's memoir. I think she just would not necessarily have approved of all of the more racy details that the book includes. I think she probably would have been very happy to have the men that she loved who were rakes and not worthy of her love, perhaps. Both sisters seemed to fall for these bad men that they thought they were going to reform, and it never worked out,
Actors.
Surprisingly. Yeah. So maybe that part they wouldn't have wanted out in the public eye. But I think it's an important part of their story. So maybe I should feel more circumspect about that part, but I don't. And I think that's all for the better.
Well, obviously, you're right that there's no one left to be offended by this, either them or any on their behalf. And of course, we look at these kinds of strictures in much different ways now than we did then. But, they did kind of get up to a lot of scandalous stuff in terms of, all these many, many different marriage proposals, right, that neither of them ever came up to accepting. There's this wonderful line in one of the letters from Jane that Beanie is going to read in a little while. With some people, matrimony is a mere shopping piece of business. Yes. And many of those people came in and out of their lives, right, looking for different things to accomplish through marriage to one or the other sister. I think it's fascinating. One of the levels in which your book is fascinating is as a story of these women who managed to live outside the marriage plot. And I'm curious about how unusual they were in that way. Was that, I mean, how typical was that for a woman of their era?
Well, I think they saw themselves as in a different category. Once they were published authors and in public using their own name, and they didn't have a fortune, so they were famous women without money. I think they were clear that their marriage prospects had shifted, that they had very much shifted. And Mariah talks about this really sort of achingly and cuttingly, saying, you know, a woman, once she shows herself in public, it is the sort of the death of her private happiness. And so I think they knew that it would be harder to marry. Statistically, I don't know if we could call women writers marriage or not marriage a representative sample, but there certainly were many women who did not marry or who opted out of the marriage plot. I think for authors it was even more common because they had the stain of celebrity without, in the Porter's case, the sweetener of wealth.
Yeah, I think, you know, we have a sense, you know, from reading Jane Austen, for instance, that marriage is just the be-all and end-all for a woman of that era, right? That's where the stories go. And it's so interesting to see an example of stories that go in a different direction. You have this line about Jane with one of her early suitors where you say she wanted to marry a man like him, but she also wanted to be him.
Yes.
Where do you think that comes from for her?
So I think their mother is a really remarkable person, and to me, she really comes alive in a lot of the letters, and I hope in the pages of the book. She gave her daughters, and she also had 3 sons. She was widowed without any money and 5 children under the age of 8. So she had an amazing load. And she really felt, that, partly because a fortune teller once told her so, that her children were going to achieve greatness. And so she allowed her daughters many more freedoms. And I think much like Mrs. Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility, who says, my daughters were not raised to catch husbands. You know, I think Mrs. Porter had the same sense. And perhaps not surprisingly, both Jane and Mariah, I think, are a little bit like the Dashwood sisters. They are looking for a man who respects their intellect, who respects their interests, but who also has interestingness of his own. And I think that was really hard for them to find in a real life man. They could write about them in the pages of their novels, ad infinitum, but they weren't able to find a real life man who felt that way about them and offered all those things in return, at least as far as we can tell. They fell in love a lot, though, as you know.
They fell in love a lot, yeah. I'm curious, does their fiction exert the same kind of draw for you as their letters?
So I think what is remarkable about their fiction is that it is working within a space of moral uplift. And so I think they definitely have mixed characters in these books, but there are moments when I think the perfection is a little bit much for our taste today, right? Jane Austen has this line, pictures of perfection make me sick and wicked. I think there is something about the too perfect characters in some of their novels that might rub the wrong way today. That said, I think their novels have also immensely fascinating parts to them. They are full of cross-dressing women and femme fatale and men who are fighting in bloody battle, and it's gorily put. It's not romanticized. They really, I think, captured in fiction a lot of moving and difficult things. It's just that the sheen on it is about teaching you how to be morally good in a way that maybe we go to self-help books now rather than novels to learn about.
Yeah, interesting question. Maybe we go to novels to learn how to be bad.
Or to learn how things work in the gray areas, or what to do in the gray areas.
Yes, the gray areas, indeed. It's interesting also like how militarily focused the novels are in a way that, stereotypically we don't expect women's writing to be, right? Jane Austen never wrote about military campaigns in the way that Jane Porter did, right? You write about how, about their influence not only on Jane Austen, but also on Sir Walter Scott in terms of the historical novel. Can you say something about that? Where they fall in that genre? How much credit do they deserve for, not creating but popularizing and transforming that form?
Well, I think this is a really important and difficult question. Sometimes Sir Walter Scott is still said to have invented the historical novel.
Yeah.
That's already a claim that plays fast and loose with using history and fiction together, right? But if we say he invented the historical novel or the modern historical novel, I think once you learn about the Porter sisters, you think, wow, that claim is wrong.
Right.
Because these women who were doing things a dozen years and certainly 3 and 4 years before he brought out Waverley in 1814 were working in the same kind of method and mode. And P.S., as you know, they were friends with Sir Walter Scott as children.
Right.
And in one of those weird coincidences that doesn't make any sense, he was from a Tony family. They were at a charity school, but their families knew each other. And so I think it was one of the great frustrations and I would say even tragedies of the Porter sisters' lives that Scott came along and people started to give him credit for what they saw as having innovated on their own, rightly having innovated on their own and not getting credit for it, especially as their lives proceeded.
Right, and especially, since he did know them and was obviously aware of them and their work, it's not like we can say, oh, well, he just happened to come up with it on his own at the same time, right? There's a clear line between Jane Porter and Sir Walter Scott. And so what's your theory about how this comes to pass? How is he allowed to run away with the credit for the historical novel?
So Jane Porter publishes her first best-selling historical romance, she called it, but we'd call it probably modern historical novel, in 1803, Thaddeus of Warsaw. And her sister starts writing things in that vein, The Hungarian Brothers, and then Jane publishes The Scottish Chiefs in 1810. All of these were bestsellers. And Scott comes out with Waverley in 1814 and says, oh, I had this idea a long time ago. I just stuck it in a drawer and I forgot about it. And it's very convenient because it makes it seem, even if Waverley came after the Porter sisters, that he had this idea before. And it is true that he was publishing poetry with historical content. But the kind of method that the sisters were using, clearly he owed something to them. Clearly he did. And they thought that he was either stealing, or they use the word theft and vampirism. And I think those both apply. Those terms apply.
Yeah, it's so strong.
They weren't dummies. I mean, they knew that people were ripping each other off all the time. They just wanted him to give them a kind of genteel word of praise.
Absolutely. Yes, I'm outraged 200 years later at that vampire, Sir Walter Scott. It must have been really challenging, just technically speaking, to work with all these letters, right? You write in the book about how, leaving aside the trickiness of deciphering handwriting and all that whole component of it. Which I do want to hear about. But you talk in the book about how the sisters communicated with each other in euphemisms, using kind of encoded language when they were worried that somebody else might get their hands on these letters. How did you figure out what they were really talking about?
Saturation, right?
Okay, yeah. Let's talk about that method. How does that work?
Yeah, so they knew a lot of famous people. So there would be words that would pop up in the letters, and it would be like, wow, okay, Wordsworth and Byron, and here are people we know very well that they had interactions with, but there were also people I'd never heard of, and I had a hard time tracing. And partly it's because the sisters, as you said, would speak in euphemism and code. So they would say, I saw Agamemnon and Apollo today. And I would think, did they know men named Agamemnon and Apollo? But of course they didn't. They were trying to hide the identities of these men in case their letters were intercepted, in case one of their 3 brothers happened to open these letters. So
they could really get in trouble for what they were up to.
They absolutely could. And so this was a way to, give a little bit of cover to themselves. So ultimately, it became clear from context who Agamemnon was, who Apollo was. These were stories that they were telling to each other over and over. And the men that they fell for, it was years' worth of letters. So often it became obvious to me who it was. I do think it's interesting. There are some places in their correspondence where they say, I'm going to tell you something so secret that I want to write it in lemon juice or in milk, and then you're going to hold it up to the fire to be able to read it like it's invisible, like what we would think of as invisible ink, right? So no library will let me hold these
Fascinating.
letters up to a heat source. I don't know. Like,
You can't just whip out your Zippo lighter and,
and it's not clear
oh,
they
well,
ever did it. It's not
lost
clear
to
they ever did it.
history, whatever they wrote in invisible ink.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it wouldn't work at this point anyway. Who
Right,
knows?
right.
But I know from being a biographer myself that after you spend, a certain amount of time really immersing yourself in somebody's archive, these secrets magically, mysteriously somehow start to yield themselves up to you. But it takes a long time and a lot of immersion to learn how to read and archive in this way. And so you worked on this book for around 20 years,
Yes.
correct?
Yes.
And so at what point did it start to feel like you had that kind of mastery that, where you could see a reference to Agamemnon and go, oh yeah, that's Henry, or, whoever it happened to be. How did you get there?
I think there was a day when I realized I knew the name of Mrs. Porter, their mother's undertaker. And I thought, okay, this is like jump the shark. Like, I don't even know this about members of my own family.
Right, yes.
So 7,000 letters, was a lot of letters to read. And I wish I could have read them all the second time, the first time, so I knew what I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that these letters have more treasures than even I was able to dig up. I'm thrilled at having been able to piece together what I did. But really, it is just starting to feel like you're part of this world. And I know there are novelists who talk about doing this in their heads. I was piecing it together from the page, from the historical record, and from this family archive. And it felt exciting to be able to give the shape. Some people say when they read this book, it strikes them as like a novel, and that is the biggest praise to me, because I wanted to take these stories and breathe life into them in a way that allowed you to imagine yourself as part of this world.
Yeah. And so did you find anything in the process of researching this book that really transformed your prior conception of the sisters?
My prior conception of the sisters, yeah, that's a good question. Absolutely. I mean, there were lots of moments that made me continually reimagine who they were over the course of their lives. And I think made me think differently about authors from this period. They changed a lot. I mean, they of course, right? I think there's sometimes we say, well, Jane Austen was this, or the Brontes were this. And of course, if we look at their lifespan, they were many different things over the course of decades. So to watch the sisters change and reflect, I think, was one of the things, as I aged myself writing the book, that I think was a gift to see how reflecting on your earlier life and your earlier memories can be rejuvenating and can be sad. And for the sisters, I think they were both.
Did you ever have one of those moments in the archive where you read something that just like makes you drop the paper and say, oh my God, I had no idea they would do that?
Yeah, well, I think for me, it's one of the moments that I start describing at the beginning of the book, which I was reading this letter from Anna Maria Porter and at an 1820 dinner party, and she was describing just in excruciatingly hilarious detail all these men around her and gluttony and people just behaving badly and staring at her, gawking at her. And she said, I wished for the pen of Jane Austen to record this company and to give them immortality. And I thought, wow, in 1820, Jane Austen died in 1817. In 1820, they already thought of Jane Austen as great. And I also at the same time thought, Anna Maria doesn't need to wish for anybody else's pen. Her letter is comic genius. She has captured so much in these letters. I think the Porter sisters' novels deserve to be known. They absolutely deserve to be known and reread. I think the historical novel maybe doesn't travel through time quite as well as Jane Austen's fiction does. What the 19th century says about the 17th century is yet one more remove, and I think it doesn't necessarily hold up as well as we might think. But these letters are absolutely works of magisterial genius, and I'm just thrilled to have been able to use them in this story. And P.S., their brother married a Russian princess. Can you believe it took us as long to say that? So, I mean, this story just has things that come at you from one angle and another, and it's incredible.
Yeah. So I just want to remind you all, we are gonna continue for a few more minutes, but you have the index cards and pencils for you to write your own questions and submit them if there are things that I haven't yet covered that you are interested in knowing about this book or about Devoney's process in writing it. I want to just touching on, that the period, part of the reason you spent so long writing this book. And, of course, in the world of biography, 20 years is actually not that long a period of time. I mean, Robert Caro has been working on his biography of Lyndon Johnson for longer than either of us has been alive. But you talk about one of the reasons that it took as long as it did was because you had to fit it around giving birth to and raising 2 children.
Yes.
And the guilt you felt about, having to leave them behind. Biography is not a business that's particularly conducive to raising children, right? There's a lot of travel. There's a lot, you need to be able to immerse yourself in this work in a way that's very hard when you're, also a parent and a caregiver and all that. And, it reminds me of, there's this line from Alice Munro where she says that she started writing short stories because she didn't have enough time to write novels. She had to fit in her work around her, her caretaking and child rearing responsibilities. And I wonder, to what extent your concerns as a woman in the 21st century, how did they affect the way you saw the lives of Jane and Mariah, who weren't married, didn't have children, but had a whole different set of obligations and responsibilities?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I reflect on is that they would find my life and the possibility of it absolutely bizarre, right? Mm-hmm. That one could be a scholar, a professor, a wife, a mother, that all of these things could be part of one day. And often my mother or my husband came to the archives with me and made it possible for me to do the work when our children were infants. All these fellowships, including a fellowship from the NYPL, made this possible. So I think the sisters would find it absolutely bizarre that there were these structures in place and this support in place to make this possible. But I also felt that their lives had made mine possible. And that the lives of 19th century women who wrote and who cared about history and who cared about putting it down on the page and the things that they struggled through, that they had paved the way. And I really felt like this was doing a service, and an homage to them was due, given the kinds of things I had the opportunity to do. I got to do all of these things that I cared about, and it was a struggle. But there was financial support in place. There was family support in place. The Porter sisters didn't have that.
Before we turn things over to Beanie, do you have any advice for other biographers who might be embarking on or thinking about books about lesser-known figures, people who aren't household names?
Yeah, I think it is hard to build an audience for people, for figures that people haven't heard of.
Yeah.
But we're never going to expand. And this is what Women's History Month is all about, right? We are never going to expand our knowledge of these unsung heroines or unsung women of the past unless more of us are willing to jump in and do this work. So I definitely would encourage biographers to pick up lesser known subjects and to create and to hope to build their audience for these people who deserve, this is their due. Especially these women. This is these women's due.
All right. Okay. Well put. Well, thank you, Devoney. I'll just remind you all again, please do write questions and they will be collected. And now I'll invite Beanie Feldstein to come up on stage and read to us 2 letters by the Porter sisters.
And I'm going to do a short introduction of each of these 2 letters before Beanie reads, just to set the stage. So in 1809, when Mariah Porter was in poor health and financially struggling, she was invited to stay with the fabulously wealthy Margravine of Ansbach, a twice-widowed woman in her late 50s. Mariah's visit had 3 aims: to get well by leaving her family's stamp cottage, to finish what would become her 8th novel in comfort on a luxurious estate, and to convince the Margravine to pay off her beloved Robert's large debts. The Margravine had long referred to Robert as her adopted son, despite her having 7 adult children of her own. In fact, she was on speaking terms then with just one of her 7 children, her sensitive youngest son, Keppel Craven. Keppel and Mariah were both in their late 20s and single, and during Mariah's months-long stay on the Margravine's estate, she discovered she had feelings for Keppel. But Mariah couldn't read his mixed messages. He'd cling to her, push her away. He had constant struggles with his controlling mother, and he was entirely financially dependent on the Margravine. So Mariah, living in this emotional chaos, wrote long letters home to Jane, seeking help in interpreting what was happening around her. So this that Beanie is about to read is an adapted excerpt from a 7-page letter written over the course of 3 tumultuous days. So Anna Mariah Porter to Jane Porter, October 22nd, 1809.
My dearest Jane, your promised letter has not appeared, so I begin another scrawl in which I shall enclose another list of my expenses so that my dear mother may see how my money flies. I can assure you that to ask for more is always bitter to me since we have so little, but you will recognize that I really try not to spend a farthing that might be avoided. When I wrote last, my spirits were all sunshine. Now they have somewhat clouded, but our atmosphere can't always be bright. Clouds will darken it occasionally, and with that thought, I try to soothe myself. I want you to know Keppel Craven as I know him. For instance, when his friend Mr. Gell is pleased with anyone, he has a habit of saying curious, flattering things, and I just laughed at his jests. Even though I pay less attention to him than Keppel, I dare not let others notice it. How can I behave? If I'm lively only with Keppel, others will jest at my partiality, and the Margravine may deem it indiscreet behavior with her favorite son. If I'm grave and reserved, our intimacy will wither. If I grow cold or cross toward Gell, he may become my enemy. I don't know how to act. Of this I am sure. I am not a coquette. My conscience is clear. In the midst of my uncertainty about Keppel, the Margravine puzzles me perpetually. Sometimes I think she believes Keppel and I are mutually attracted and approves. Sometimes I suspect she's uncertain how far we understand each other, and therefore tries to extract it out of me by different methods. I have but one line of conduct. Whenever she speaks to me and implies that I love Keppel, I am silent. I neither confess nor deny. Whatever a woman may do, her preference for a beau may always be seen, but a man's preference may be observed only by the object of it. For instance, I am rather shy of Keppel in company, yet everyone appears to know the interest I take in him, but very few notice any interest he takes in me. Yesterday I was so happy, and today I am quite overcome. Please tell me whether my conduct was right or wrong. I'll relay the incidents of yesterday. During dinner, Keppel was particularly attentive. He asked me if I noticed, after I had objected to the new way of wearing his hair, that he had altered it. His expressions made Gell's sister exclaim, "And all these things to please Miss Porter. Very well, Mr. Craven, I understand now." At dessert, a Mr. Nixon arrived. Gell gaily proposed dancing round the table. Everyone started up. Keppel seized my hand and Gell's sister's, and round we went like mad folks. Our circular dance lasted an age, for Nixon had gone to change his dress. Keppel dropped Mrs. Gell's hand, but retained mine. On Nixon's appearance, our dance ended. Nixon most unexpectedly tried to kiss me. I shrieked, broke from him, and sprang to Keppel before I knew what I did. He turned crimson, but it was because of my fright. He gave me a chair with one of the kindest looks. The evening passed in gaiety and delight. After coffee, Keppel seated himself by me and never left me. He talked to me, he looked at me almost solely. I confess I was never so happy in my life, for though Gell had paid me all manner of compliments, and though Nixon had done this outrageous act, Keppel did not show any signs of dissatisfaction. Such were the events of yesterday. Judge my amazement and horror this morning when I met the Margravine for breakfast. She came up to me with a very serious yet maternal air. She laid her hand on mine. "I have something to say to you, my dear Miss Porter. I pray do not be offended with me, but you must be more guarded in your behavior to Keppel." I turned ashy pale and could not speak. She went on, "You don't know it yourself, but I think it right to tell you that when Keppel is near, you have neither eyes nor ears for anything but him. You are not innocent as a child, I am sure. You would rather die than he or anybody should suppose you are in love with him, but everybody does see it." She added, "If Keppel were to notice it himself, it's the very thing that would drive him away. He's so shy, he'd fly into the furthest corner directly. He would not like you less, but he would certainly avoid you." I could not speak through my tears. She said she was used to such perplexities, for no young woman had ever stayed with her yet to have not fallen in love with her son. The company then came in, and we sat down to breakfast. You may guess the torture I was in. My eyes were so full of tears that I dare not raise them to Keppel when he entered. Neither he nor I have exchanged a single word this morning. Here, then, all is destroyed. I see no path for me to choose but to take the Margravine's advice. Tell me, dearest Jane, dearest mother, if I judge right. Don't delay in sending me your opinion and advice. At present, my head and heart are confused. I positively know not what to think of the Margravine. I am getting better and very much fatter, so don't fear for me. God bless you both. You may see how we flatter ourselves and are deceived. Yesterday, I was so happy. Tomorrow's ball will be a penance to me. Farewell, your Mariah.
Just so beautiful to hear you give voice to that, Beanie. Okay, we have one more. In February of 1804, Jane Porter, aged 28, went on a long visit to Bath. She was the guest of the newlyweds Major and Mrs. Plunkett, who were acting as her chaperones. Jane was on top of the world, having recently published a bestseller, Thaddeus of Warsaw, which was also being declared a work of genius. The Porters, however, were secretly in debt. Jane's brothers were eager for her to marry because it would take the cost of supporting her off of the family balance sheet. They scraped together the money to send Jane to Bath, a notorious marriage market town, while Mariah stayed in London with their mother. This letter is an adapted excerpt from one of the 18 long, colorful letters that Jane sent home from Bath, sharing all she observed and felt. So Jane Porter to Anna Mariah Porter, Bath, Saturday, February 11th, 1804.
As I told you, I mean to give you and my mother a short account of the sort of folk I meet here. You may notice from the tenor of my descriptions when I am likely to be in danger of falling in love with any of the charming beaux who are presented to me here. Yesterday, being my first appearance in Bath, I was taken by Major and Mrs. Plunkett to the pump room. During our walk there, Mrs. P. entertained me with the stories of a Major Hilditch, who was the admiration of all the ladies and a general admirer of them in return. He is resolved not to leave Bath unmarried and promises £2,000 a year to make a lucky lady happy. When I entered the pump room, which was a fine rotunda, I was very pleased with the scene. The fountain, which is formed of white marble, flows with sparkling smoking water at one end of the room, and at the other is the orchestra, where a band plays for the amusement of the company, who saunter up and down the room staring at each other. And never in my life did I behold such a collection of frights, men and women, one uglier than the next. A smart, conceited man with an affected kind of limp hopped towards us. Mrs. P. introduced him to me as the Major Hilditch. You know, I never say much for the first quarter of an hour when I see people for the first time, so in a few minutes of listening, I had heard enough to assure me of the arrogance and folly of the rich Major H. On leaving the room to go to the library, Mrs. P. whispered to me that the Major thought me wonderfully handsome and longed to hear me speak. I thought I would soon tire of his wonderment. When he marched up by my side, I merely said yes or no till we entered a gentleman's house who had offered to show Mrs. P. his pictures. They were very bad, and Major H. smugly asked how much I liked them. I thought some of them were good, I replied. How many? He asked. 2, I said. Then how can you make out some? He answered, puffed up. 3 may be some, but 2 cannot. And then he smiled and strutted, pulled up his neckcloth, and looked over at Major and Mrs. P. with a glance that said, see how clever I am, how wise she thinks me. However, I very coolly replied, I would thank you, sir, to explain why 2 cannot be expressed by the word some as well as 3. I should think that as some is a word to express the plural number, it may as well express 2 as 100. If you can prove me otherwise, I consider myself obliged. The poor Major said not another word and looked very cross. When we arrived at the library door, he took a hasty leave and disappeared. I laughed heartily with Mrs. P., who was proceeding to repeat all the fine things he'd said of me. I told her I was sure from the specimens of my speaking power, which he'd drawn out of me, he would never recommence the attacks. I've since learned that this same gentleman is a great puppy who believes that no woman can see him and not be ready to accept his hand in marriage. So I'm very glad to have drawn daggers at the first interview. A Mr. Kelly, a young, good-humored, silly sort of gaybo, with a few hundred per annum, was another guest, and a Dr. Perkett, a bath physician, with a little odd body full of good nature and nonsense, was the other. These three gentlemen afforded me entertainment enough, and when we ladies joined them at tea, the doctor's poor little tongue was set off by the wine he had drunk, and he ran out at a most ridiculous rate, making me the heroine of his conversation. And in fact, he grew so fond of me, I'm relieved Mr. Bachelor did not wed us immediately. In truth, Mariah, nothing can be more absurd than the marrying mania that seems to absorb every imagination in this place. Were we heathens, I should expect to see a temple in honor of the great god Hymen gracing every corner. I assure you, it's very laughable. I'm ready to burst into a violent ha-ha 10 times in the course of a day. I had no idea before I saw it that with some people, matrimony is a mere shopping piece of business. They first look at one woman and then another, and without either warmth or emotion, take one for better or for worse just because they want a wife and think her pretty or good-natured. I would soon as jump into a boiling cauldron than marry in one of those matrimonial warehouses. Today, we are at home, but the next new folks I see, I will write again. If my scrawl is dull, you must attribute it to the stupidity of my subjects.
Thank you, Beanie. Oh my gosh, that was just brilliant. And thank you so, so much.
That was wonderful. Speed dating from 200 years ago. The
Right.
matrimonial warehouse. You'll have to love it. All right. All right, here I'm just having a quick look through these.
So grateful
Okay,
to all of
some
you for
very
coming out.
interesting
So grateful. This
questions
is
here.
fun. I love to see all these cards in her hands. This is thrilling.
Yeah, and there's still time. I think they're going to be collected one more time if other questions occur to you all. All right, well, we have a question about their brothers.
Yes.
We didn't talk about them at all. What were their brothers like?
So 3 brothers. They had one who was their favorite, Robert Kerr Porter. He was actually a celebrated panoramic artist who then became a soldier, a travel writer, and a diplomat and married that Russian princess. So they loved him very much, but they ended up, and I hope you'll want to read about this in the book, they ended up needing to support not only him, but the Russian princess with their writing.
And I have a follow-up question here. Tell us about the Russian princess.
Yes. So they referred to her as the horror princess, the horror. Selfish and difficult, and he met her when he was a painter for the Tsar in Russia. He traveled there when he was in debt. He left the country a lot to avoid his debts, Robert did. And so one of the times he was there, this princess fell in love with him. They spent many years engaged, and they ultimately married. It was supposed to be the making of the whole family, and it actually made things worse. And to be a Russian princess during the Napoleonic Wars, definitely not the best time to be a Russian princess. So
It sounds so glamorous.
That
but
part is not on her. But the part where she went deeply, deeply in debt, that is absolutely on her. And she was a nightmare. She treated Jane like a servant the time that she came to England. She was an absolute nightmare. And Mariah later used her as a character in a novel. So that was her comeuppance.
Okay, so you say the sisters had almost no money, but they wrote bestsellers. So why were they not wealthy from their books?
I think these two questions are interrelated.
Yes.
That is, the brothers' debts definitely pulled the family's income and the sisters' income down. There were periods where they were better off, some periods where they were better off than others. But once you got into a hole of debt, it was, then I think as now, very hard to pull yourself out of it. So they started living on advances from their publishers, and by the time the books came out, the looked-for windfall was already basically needed and spent. So they started with nothing. They ended up during periods where they had something, but then they were in, I think, what we would call genteel poverty. for some of the most famous writers of the age, they were living on as much as a clerk, a governess, a teacher would make, which wasn't very much.
Many have said historical novels reveal more about the author's time than about the past. Is this true of Thaddeus of Warsaw and the Scottish chiefs?
Yes, I think that is a great quote. I like this question. I think you're absolutely right. The reason I think that the Porters novels were so incredibly famous in this period and well received in this period is because of Napoleon and this idea of being at war with France, the possibility of the invading despot. So most of their novels are about independent struggles in moments of the either near past or far away past where countries were invaded or nations found themselves under threat from an invader. And so the sisters saw themselves as writing about liberty and writing about justice in the face of invading despots. Topical subject, as it turns out, even still, right?
Always topical.
Yes. So I do think that this is something that led to the importance of these novels. However, they definitely Christianized a lot of what they were telling us about, and they made some of their characters more contemporary gentlemen or contemporary ladies, I think, than a historian might be comfortable with now. But for readers at the time, that didn't seem to trouble as much. Some critics a little bit it troubled.
Right, you say that Jane even modeled the main character in Thaddeus of Warsaw after this army commander who she was probably in love with.
Yeah, so there was General Kosciuszko, who her brother met and had painted, and he was a real-life person.
Right. No,
but
right,
the
the other
fictional character, and this is one of the things that the Porter sisters did that I think was innovative. They melded stories that were ripped from the headlines or the headlines of the past with these fictional characters. So I do think she made her fictional hero, Thaddeus Sobieski, from this novel, a combination of the two men she loved most in her life. One was a famous naval hero, Sir Sidney Smith. Everyone's heard of Lord Nelson. Very few people have heard of Sir Sidney Smith, but in their own day, they were both equally famous. And Napoleon banned Jane Porter's books at one point because he feared that they would lead people to have bad ideas about what to do to despots. And Sir Sidney Smith was said to have caused Napoleon to miss his destiny. So he was definitely an inspiration for her.
Wow. And what impact did the book banning have on her career?
I'm not sure the answer to that in Europe. The books were still being translated. I can tell you that she did fabulously well in the United States. And we know that by 1840, 1 million volumes of Jane Porter's novels had sold here in the US. 1 million. That's crazy. That's a crazy number of volumes. So now some novels were multiple volumes, but that's still a crazy number of volumes, from which she received 0 because there was no copyright, international copyright protection of any kind for her there. So I think Napoleon probably helped her in some places by the ban and hurt her in others. She was proud of it.
So all those publishers made money off of all those books by Jane Porter, and she didn't see any
And
of
I
it.
have a chapter about how they all banded together and gave her a chair to show how much they appreciated all the money they made off of her.
Yeah,
a rocking
lovely.
chair. And she didn't even have a home to put it in. That is what is most crushing. She had no home of her own to put it in.
How were her books received by critics of her time?
So at the time, I think there were, especially in the early 19th century, there were people who were very excited about what the Porter sisters were doing because novels were seen then as trash. Novels were seen as this genre that was throwaway, ephemeral, mostly for unserious readers. Serious readers wanted poetry and drama and nonfiction, religious works, histories, not novels. So Jane Porter's novels seemed to be doing some things that were appreciated with history. They were involved, they used research. So they did some things with the novel that were seen as more serious and more ennobling. So there were people who declared her a genius and said these were works of genius. When Scott came around in the 18 teens, the entire literary field shifted, and it shifted away from women being seen as the better and more likely novel writers and the more gifted novel writers to men being seen as the more gifted novel writers. Scott really single-handedly shifted with his great success and perhaps deserved success. I don't know how many Scott fans there are in the audience.
If vampiric success.
Right. But he got this amazing monument in Edinburgh, and she got a chair, right? So,
did you find it necessary to read against the archives and to doubt or at least question the truthfulness of what you read in the letters? How did you deal with the question of, I guess,
this is a fair and great question.
unreliable narrators,
Yes.
how people represent themselves in their letters versus how they appear in real life?
Absolutely fair question.
Yeah.
I think the Porter sisters were definitely myth makers about their own lives, and you can see that in the prefaces to their works, where they are putting a sheen on things that is clearly false based on what's in the letters. So I
Can
came
you give
to
an
trust.
example?
They started to claim that they were descended from Endymion Porter and that they had royal lineage because they wanted their brother to get a knighthood. So they lied about their past. There's a letter from Robert saying, I have no idea if we're descended from Endymion Porter, but it would be really convenient if we were. And so they just started claiming these things. So I do think there was a lot of mythologizing. I have chosen to see the letters as the more reliable source than the prefaces. But I also made the choice to front the sisters' voices and to center the sisters' voices in this book. I hope there will be more books on them, and I hope that future biographers will consider all of the ways that they may have been massaging the truth for each other. But I think there is an authenticity in their words to each other that I have chosen to believe.
Did the sisters have opportunities to travel?
Also a great question. Not much, as it turns out. They're brothers, and they have these 3 brothers, and I haven't talked much about them, but several of them, 2 of them ended up in the West Indies for work. It was not a very good place to be working and trying to make your way in the world for lots of reasons in this period. And those brothers were ne'er-do-well, and both the sisters thought that they had been educated in a school of thought because of their living on plantations and around enslaved people, that it had had a morally bad effect on these brothers. So the brothers did a lot more traveling. Jane did more traveling than Maria. She traveled both to France. She traveled to Paris with her brother Robert in the early 1820s, where she was feted and treated as a very important person. And then she traveled to Russia with him in the 1840s. So she was the one who got to do more traveling. Maria did much less.
I have one more question, actually, that I realized I didn't get to about how you dealt with gaps in the research.
Yes.
Right? The biographer's nemesis. We all have these black holes where there's no information for some certain period of time or conflicting information. It's just a convention of the form that there are places where we have to kind of smooth over those gaps by saying, Jane must have done this or Maria might have done that. And I wonder what your philosophy was in approaching those moments where you have to engage in this kind of informed speculation. Did you have sort of rules that you made for yourself around
I was
that?
very fortunate having a great editor, Grace McNamee, who I think is here somewhere, who was, we first knew each other when she was my undergraduate student at the University of Missouri, and now I am her student as she is my editor, and she was definitely helpful there. And the Porters, I like to say with Jane Austen, finding anything new is like looking for a needle in the haystack. The Porters, you've got the whole haystack, and the question is, how do you give it shape? So there are, of course there are gaps, but fewer than you might think. So when I came across sections that I needed to emphasize or not emphasize, I think I used words like probably and must have, and those are, as you say, the tricks that one
The
uses.
biographer's crutch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I still feel like there was too much material. Not that I had to. I didn't feel like there were gaps. Of course there are gaps. There are ways to tell each life that leave certain things out. I think there's less of Jane Porter's old age in here than I wish there were. But it's not because there's a gap. It's
Still,
because the book
yeah.
is already long.
Too much material is a fantastic problem for
Truly.
a biographer to have.
Truly.
I want to end on one final question, which is, you're a teacher also. The question is, how can we encourage young children and teenagers, especially girls, to write?
Yeah, and I teach mostly at the college level, so I get.
But you're still encouraging them at
Of
that
course,
point.
absolutely. So I think we love storytelling, and I think the way that stories have come down to us are through writing. It's shocking to me when I try to teach paleography, which is a study of old handwriting, that I'm starting to get students who really never lived in a world where there was handwriting.
Yeah.
So I hope that we will continue to teach handwriting, at least to some people, and that even if you're composing on a keyboard, that you're aware that this used to be the major way that people had contact and intimacy with each other. But I think as long as there is storytelling, there will be writing in some form. And it's fine with me if some of that storytelling moves into audio or video. I just want it to be told.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, congratulations on this beautiful book. And thank you for this wonderful conversation. I learned so much from hearing you talk tonight. I'm sure everybody else did too. So with that, we'll wrap up. I'm not sure if I'm wrapping up or someone else is going to come back here. Okay, but so Devoney is going to be out in front doing a book signing for the next 20 minutes or so. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.